Welcome CVGS students. This is our flipped classroom for Unit 5 and we are going to be covering chapters 15 and 16. This is going to be our second unit in which we're going over the nervous system and different applications of it. So for this chapter we are going to be looking at our sensory pathways and then we're going to touch on the motor pathways for our somatic nervous system as well. As a quick review, let's go over some of the things we learned in chapter 12 about the divisions of our nervous system. So we have our two major divisions of the nervous system, which is going to be our CNS, which includes our brain and spinal cord, as well as everything else outside of the CNS, which is going to be our peripheral nervous system. We're not worried about the ENS right now. Do recall that our peripheral nervous system is going to be made up of an afferent and an efferent division. The afferent division is where you're detected by receptors, which will send signals up through the afferent neurons, creating action potentials, which will then go in and take information to the CNS, where your brain and spinal cord are going to interpret that information. When you need to cause some sort of response within the body, the CNS will then send a signal down its efferent division. Those are going to be motor commands to cause some sort of response. That efferent division is divided into our somatic nervous system and our autonomic nervous system, and both of those will send out signals or action potentials to the effectors to cause the response that your body wants. Now, this chapter that we're looking at in 15 is going to be covering the somatic nervous systems for its motor commands, and then we're going to cover the autonomic nervous system motor commands in chapter 16, which is why I'm combining the two chapters for this flipped classroom. So first what we're going to do is we're going to go over the afferent division and how we're going to pick up sensory information. So for this slide, we're looking at an overview of all the events that occur in those two different pathways, both our sensory and our motor pathways. Now we're going to focus on the sensory pathway first, which is shown here kind of in that purple color. For a sensory pathway, in order for us to bring information into our CNS, you have some sort of stimulus that is going to be detected by a receptor. So that sensory receptor is going to depolarize because of that stimulus. So the depolarization causes that graded potential or graded change within that receptor, which if it meets threshold, then it will trigger an action potential. And remember, action potentials are all or none. You either have that action potential or you do not. Once you have that action potential, it will then propagate on its own all the way down the length of the axon until it gets to the end of the axon terminals. So that will be either through that saltatory or that continuous propagation that we talked about in earlier chapters. Once we propagate that information all the way down, then it's going to reach the central nervous system. So for that central nervous system, you're going to process that information and then you're going to relay it to the correct spot so that you can figure out exactly what that action potential is going to mean. That sensory information can go to multiple places within the brain stem, to the diencephalon, to the different parts of the cerebrum in order to process that information. Once you've processed all that information and you need to have some sort of response to it, you are then going to travel down that motor pathway. So the motor pathway can be voluntary or involuntary in nature. So the involuntary pathways are going to show that you're going to have the processing centers within your spinal cord or brainstem, and they're going to cause some sort of reflexive response that you're going to respond to it before it even reaches your cerebral cortex to actually figure out what it means. So later on you can figure that out, but initially if it's a reflexive response, your cerebral cortex is not involved with the motor response that's going to occur from it. In terms of your voluntary pathway, you only perceive about 1% of all sensations that are going to be relayed to that primary somatosensory cortex. So in terms of that sensation that you're looking at, a sensation is when you just receive sensory information that goes to the CNS. That's what we call a sensation. So all of this from the purple pathway into the blue, we refer to that as a sensation. You don't have conscious awareness of that until your CNS and your cerebral cortex is going to process that. And that's what we refer to as perception. So perception is actually understanding what that sensation was. Initially, when that sensation is going to be occurring, you're going to have the stimulus that comes in, and the stimulus is going to go through what we refer to as transduction. That transduction is taking that stimulus and converting it into an action potential. And then you have the action potential that can be generated and propagate to the CNS. So you will start with a stimulus causing transduction. That transduction is going to cause our sensation that goes to the CNS. As our CNS processes it, Then your cerebral cortex is going to figure out what it meant, and then we consider that to be perception. And only about 1% of all the different things that you're actually picking up through your receptors to go through your CNS are you consciously aware of it. Then with that perception that you do have some voluntary response. It can be moderate, it can enhance or supplement whatever that involuntary reflexive response was going to be. So this is the overall pathway we're going to be looking at. We're going to be focusing on the sensory pathway for the first part of this. So let's talk about those receptors. The receptors that you have are very specific to one type of stimulus. You have many different types of receptors in your body. In elementary school, they probably talked a lot about your special senses. So with your special senses, those are not going to be touch and temperature. Touch and temperature are what we refer to as general somatic senses. Your special senses are going to be things like your vision, hearing, taste, and smell, all of which will have more scientific names to it. So when we're talking about smell, smell is called olfaction. Taste is called gustation. Vision is your sight. And then equilibrium or balance. Those are all going to be part of your special senses that you have. They're going to have specialized sense organs that will have those receptors that can detect those particular stimuli. When we talk about general senses are your sense of temperature, pain, touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. Proprioception is probably the only one of those that you haven't heard of before, but that's basically knowing what your body position is going to be in space and relative to itself. Now, when we talk about detecting stimuli, the receptors have specificity. So they have a very specific characteristic that they are looking for that they are able to detect. Here we're looking at a section of the skin. We can see our epidermis at the top and then dermis that's going to be below it with our hypodermis or subcutaneous layer here. What we're looking at are going to be these free nerve endings here. The free nerve endings are considered to be our receptor. And what you're looking at is a receptive field. So there are two different receptive fields, and that's going to be the area that is monitored by that specific receptor. When you have a receptive field that is very large, you will have poor localization, which means that it's harder to detect exactly where in this receptive field that it is going to be located. If you have a very small receptive field, then it's very easy to pinpoint the exact location that the stimulus is going to be hitting. So when a receptor is going to receive a stimulus, it's going to go through that transduction where it's going to convert that stimulus to an action potential that's going to travel through the CNS. The stimulus has to change that membrane potential because it has receptor potential. The receptor potential is what allows us to change based on the stimulus. Recall from the previous unit where we had gated channels that allowed us to depolarize that particular area. We could have chemically gated channels, mechanically gated, or even voltage graded channels. Whatever receptor that you have is specific to that stimulus. So when that stimulus comes in and say it's a chemical, then that chemical will cause us to open up those channels, which will allow us to depolarize and create that potential and change the receptor potential. That can help bring us closer to threshold. You can also have receptor potential, though, that is hyperpolarizing, and it moves you further away from threshold, making it harder for you to generate the action potential. We know that action potentials are action potentials. So how does the brain actually interpret what that action potential means? And we're going to look at the labeled line principle for that. The labeled line principle talks about how you have a very particular pathway that the action potential is going to take, and then it's going to be processed later within the sensory somatic cortex within the brain. The path that it is taking from all the way to the type of receptor or the modality that it picked up for that receptor, then it's going to pass down a specific sensory neuron. Then it's going to go down a specific neuron that's going to be within your brainstem or diencephalon, and then finally you're going to take another neuron that's going to go to your brain for you to interpret that within your cerebral cortex. We're going to have neurons that are first order, second order, and third order, and we're going to talk about those later. But the order of those and the pathway that those neurons are taking is going to be what we refer to as that labeled line. So it lets us know exactly which receptor is dedicated to one particular stimulus, which goes through a very specific pathway through those first, second, then third order neurons to eventually get to your brain, and then your brain will then interpret that signal, that action potential, as to what it actually means based on where it came from, the frequency, and the pattern of the action potentials that are going to be happening as well. We refer to sensory coding, and that sensory coding is going to tell us what the strength, duration, and variation of the stimulus was, which is determined by the frequency and the pattern of the action potentials that are going down that labeled line. And that's how your brain figures out exactly what that stimulus meant to begin with. One of the aspects of sensory receptors is that they are able to go through what we refer to as adaptation. In adaptation, we're going to reduce the receptor sensitivity because of some sort of constant stimulus. When you're continually exposed to that stimulus, you don't want your body to be perceiving that all the time because it's basically like background information at that point. You don't need to know and have perception of it all the time because that would be dedicating too many resources to noticing something that is always there. So our sensory receptors have the ability to adapt to that, and their sensitivity is going to change when there is a constant stimulus. The types of receptors that we can classify based on how they adapt. So we can have tonic receptors and we can have phasic receptors. Looking at the graph, you can see that the tonic receptors, they're going to be continually firing their action potentials. And that is the constant stimulus, so they're going to be firing, firing, firing. What's going to happen, though, is when the stimulus increases suddenly, they're going to change the frequency of that action potential, and you're going to have a lot more frequent action potentials that are coming through, and your body will then determine, oh, well, something is happening, so I will go ahead and try to perceive that increase in the stimulus because the action potentials have increased. You also have phasic receptors. Phasic receptors, on the other hand, even though they are going to be stimulated, are going to be inactive. So even if there is a stimulus that is always there, if it's being detected by a phasic receptor, the phasic receptor is not going to fire an action potential unless something changes in those conditions, and then it will fire an action potential. This adaptation process that we have is way our nervous system is going to quickly adapt to things having constant stimulation. So for instance, our fast adapting receptors are going to be our phasic receptors. Our phasic receptors are going to be things like temperature, where we are going to detect very quickly if there is a change in it, and then the phasic receptor will then fire because there is a change. But you're always detecting temperature. Temperature is always around you, so you're always going to have that. But if there's a change in the temperature, that's when they will start firing. Tonic receptors are always going to be firing. Slow adapting receptors, though, are going to be receptors like to things like pain. If you have pain as a constant stimulus, you're always having those action potentials that are being sent. If there is an increase in pain, though, you're going to have an increase in the frequency of the action potentials. You can have peripheral or central adaptation. Central adaptation is going to involve the central nervous system, and it's going to inhibit different nuclei along the sensory pathway. When you have the incoming sensory information, it's processed in centers in your spinal cord, your brain, or your thalamus before it reaches the cerebral cortex. And so if you have that central adaptation, the central adaptation could be inhibiting it on the spinal cord or inhibiting it on the brainstem or even the thalamus before it even gets to the cerebral cortex, so you're not able to perceive that particular adaptation because of it.